name is Matana Ichkwene. I am from the Trade Department in the African Union Commission. I just want to perhaps ask a question on this notion of developmental regionalism that is basically sustained by a developmental state, and cast my question from a perspective of protectionism that is perceived to be a notion of countries that may characterize themselves as developmental. Take, for example, one would think that for a developmental state, the issue of export taxes to promote value addition locally becomes important. And they would also think that it actually also is important even in the region. So perhaps when we pursue this discussion within the context of developmental regionalism, we need to be able to make national interests part of what becomes important at the region. That will be the first point. And then the second point is, how do we, in terms of modalities, how do we make regional integration a project of the people? We often talk of declarations that are cast in with the heads of states of SADC or AU or any other regional economic community, and basically leaving out the people. And without that component, sitting in that governmental processes for some time now, I see that we might not be going anywhere at the speed that we want. And then the important role of a private sector that understands the regional dynamics and is ready to contribute to a successful regional integration program. Again, in terms of modalities, how can this be done? We all understand that it's important that the private sector, as the people who actually use regional trade agreements, are part of the process. But they are not forthcoming sometimes. You sit in meetings with them, they are not interested. They will tell you, I would rather export on an MFN basis rather than pursue a very difficult regional integration agreement with very complicated rules of origin. So how do we bring this to the level where it should be? Thank you very much.
Fundira from Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute. Thank you, Professor, for the interesting presentation. My question is just on when you look at regional integration and the whole idea about Africa being a poor country, poor continent, what we've seen is that the regional integration agenda, as far as I'm concerned, it has been more concentrating on how African countries can increase their growth. But the issue of poverty reduction is not coming out through these agendas. If you look at just the graphs that you put across, we've seen phases where Africa has experienced high growth, and at this point in time, there's this whole notion of Africa rising. But what is it rising on? Is it just growth only? Because if you look at poverty reduction, that is not really translated into significant impact issue when you link the two. But also we are also seeing a rise in inequality. So while we're integrating, which means that there's also this whole notion of free movement of people, but the social safety nets for those people that we actually need to be looking at to reduce poverty and destitution are not really being addressed. I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Zoto Mabuza from COMESA. Thank you, Prof, for the interesting presentation, especially the point that you made at the beginning, that regional integration is too important to be left to the institutions of regional integration. And it is very true for Africa's regional integration initiatives. But as you've rightly pointed out, within one institution, if I may take the example of the government, you have a disconnect among the ministries. You put the ministries of finance. They are purely looking at it from a finance point of view, import taxes. And then you bring together the trade ministries, well and good. We see the benefits of free trade. Again, Africa has different experiences. We do have some countries that have benefited from regional integration. But then if you look deeper, you realize that it calls for countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, who are in the Indian Ocean. They can't survive on their own. They really need to open up. And then you look at countries like the DRC, Congo, Angola. They trade mainly in natural resources at MFN rate. So basically, when you look at their interest in regional integration, they may not be keen. But then you have this issue of, which you've raised, how we view nation states versus regional integration institutions. Some people think perhaps states are a hindrance to regional integration. I would make an example of the principles of negotiations of the tripartite free trade area. One of the principles is that the negotiations will be driven by regs stroke member states. That in itself brings some ambiguities. Who is driving the negotiation? Is it the regs or it is the member states? Practically on the ground, clearly, the negotiations are being driven by member states. And then the issue of Afrocrat. Do we have Afrocrats vis-a-vis Eurocrats? In all the negotiations sessions that I've sat in, clearly national interests are driving, take prominence in these negotiations. The question then is, how do we convince our negotiators to say, let's look beyond national interest, let's look at the benefits of regional integration. I think that's the major challenge that we're faced with. And the issue of individual versus national interest, I would say how things happen. To me, it's an indication of very weak institutions in Africa. Why should we have, for instance, you've just spoken about the NIPAD, which was driven by the 3 African heads of state. And they left and, find Mbeki was there, Obasanjo and Wade, but are we seeing more drive on the NIPAD initiative now? It seems like it was more driven by individuals than perhaps stronger institutions. And maybe my last comment, you've touched on on many issues. It would be interesting to update your presentation, perhaps look at data that is post 2005-06, especially after the global financial crisis, to see how Africa is and how other economies have fared post the global financial crisis. Thank you.
Chair, you've caught me in a tight position in the way I had structured my question, but I'll be brief on them. Professor, allow me seek a clear understanding from you in that when we're looking at the aspect of regional integration in Africa, really in 2014, is it more feasible today than during the times of Kwame Nkrumah? Because I find myself in a situation whereby, if you look at the 60s, Africa had statesmen vis-a-vis the current scenario whereby we have politicians. So the real enabling environment for the regional integration becomes quite difficult in an era of politicians vis-a-vis an era of statesmen. So I really don't know that we as technocrats and the institutions might be pushing for something that really might not be, because the political will in each of the capitals is too strong. Godfrey Salia, my name's from Uganda, Kampala, Uganda, Uganda Manufacturing Association. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. Then, Professor, I wanted us also to help us understand the aspect of the growth of China and India vis-a-vis the environment in which Africa is. Because if we say regional integration and we're looking at Africa growing, and we have China as a superpower currently, that it is even inviting African heads of states to Beijing and they're asked, how much can I lend to each of you? So I don't know whether the African integration will really happen in a situation whereby currently China and India is more strong and actually stronger than the EU and the US. So the impact of China and India might be a threat to us. Then, lastly, is the aspect of South Africa currently hosting us. That if you asked South Africa, are you more into the BRICS or are you into the African Union? I think now that helps us settle the case that South Africa, can you speak it aloud? Are you more into the BRICS or are you into the African Union? So I'm finding us whereby as various countries within the African continent, we seem to be pursuing different, that we might look at the African Union as something so beautiful and rosy, but then the biggest economies are not really determined to look at it growing and are desirous to push the BRICS agenda. So really, I'll be happy if you could help me understand that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Gus Mandigora from Oxfam. I was very interested in the remark you made, which I agree with, which is about regional integration often, well, being state-led and often elite-led. Now, in a lot of my observations, serious discussions about trade are like echo chambers, like with the same people speaking the same language, seeing each other all the time, and nobody else understanding what's going on. So my question is, how do we change that? Especially now that we've got the TFTA, which is basically looking at Africa-wide integration. And I've also noticed that the TFTA, outside forums such as this one and outside the negotiating platforms, the TFTA is not well known at all. So how do we publicize that? How do we get people to understand it? And how do we get people to actually engage in it? And not the echo chamber and elitist kind of way we've done things before. Thank you.
Well, the first question, which is related in a sense to what you said in the last point, is how to make this Pan-African thing a people's project. Pan-Africanism was, until 1958, an NGO agenda. It was a non-governmental organizations that ran Pan-Africanism. There were all these, like, there were no governments were running Pan-African. It was a non-governmental agenda, if you like, in terms of contemporary language. But it was, and then it changed from 1958. It became a state project. So we have to find ways of recapturing, bringing Pan-Africanism into, once again, into something that is popular. At least it has some link to popular movements in Africa. Even in Europe, some of the debates have in Europe is the anchoring of the European project to society is a serious problem, and I have no idea how this is going to be done. But I'm actually just sometimes depressed by the fact that much of the NGO world today has no interest in the Pan-African project. They're much more engaged in this North-South international arrangements, with Oxfam, for example, and very little of the African. I mean, the strength of the non-government project of Pan-African. I'll give it a simple illustration. In 1958, there was a big conference in Accra, and there was a delegation of 3 people. One was from Kenya, one was from Malawi, and one was from Tanzania. And they were going to the conference, and they passed througthey'd go through Salisbury. From Salisbury, they'd go through Leopoldville, and Leopoldville, and when they were in Leopoldville, these 3 people in a hotel began talking to a waiter, and began basically criticizing the Congolese for not being involved in the struggle for independence, and that nobody from the Congo was going to this conference. This waiter then said, no, actually we are interested, but I'll take you somewhere. After my work, I'll take you a club. And he took them to the club, and there was Patrice Lumumba. And Lumumba hadn't heard about the conference. And these 3 people put together money and paid his ticket and took Lumumba with him to Accra. And that was Pan-African non-governmental organization those days, that they could do that. They could organize events themselves. And we can't do that today because it's complicated. I'm not going to that. So we have to bring back the project to a Pan-African thing. And as I said, in terms of cultural expression, if you listen to young people sing about Africa, they're quite comfortable with the idea of an Africa. It doesn't shock them to talk about Africa. So it's not something like trying to bring the Turks into the European Union, which provokes the Christian sentiments against Islam. That's not the problem in Africa. It's our problem is something has gone wrong. Obviously, developmental states, if the regional project has no developmental purpose and does not actually facilitate member states' development, of course it will not work. And that's why, in a way, NEPAD was contradictory in many ways, because on one hand, perhaps not contradictory, but it assumed that what was not working at the national level, which is a kind of a neoliberal project, would work at the continental level. my suspicion that no, it wouldn't work. And we have, I'm quite convinced that we will see, and we are beginning to see, a shift within African countries towards a much more developmentalist perspective. I think we have the neoliberal era is over intellectually. It takes a long time for dead ideas from Washington. It takes a long time for them to die in the Ministry of Finance in Africa. It's like, it's like the Vatican. When the Vatican announces something, it takes 20 years for the mission post in Malawi to get the news. So many things that are dead in Washington are being practiced with our ministries. I mean, you find the Minister of Africa very busy targeting inflation. Well, the US is saying they're targeting growth. And so anyway, there are some time lags there. But I think the pressures for performing better economically are getting stronger. It's definitely the case today, and one reason why African economies are performing reasonably well, that economic performance is one of the indicators, one of the sources of legitimacy of states in Africa. In the 60s and 70s, it was enough to say you were a hero or the founding father, and you had many medals. Okay. Today, governments talk about growth rates. They compare my country. I remember on the Kenya's inauguration of the Kenyan's president, the vice president's speech was, "Why is Ethiopia growing faster than we are growing?" I mean, so there is that important story, which is that African governments see their legitimacy based on economic performance. And if that's the case, then regional integration will have strong support if it sustains the ambitions to have higher performance. Poverty reduction, yes. I mean, we've been talking about growth, and maybe we didn't say much enough about poverty. There are two things one can say about poverty. One is, well, there are many things one can say about poverty. But it's important that a regional integration of any type has some social underpinnings. That we must think, as we think about integration, of a social Africa. Okay? Any scheme that is not socially embedded, whether it's a market or a planned economy, will collapse. So we have to have some to think that the African Union and the African institutions must be constantly thinking about how to socially embed this project of Pan-Africanism. Otherwise, it will collapse. So I think of a social Africa as part of the project. Now, the things that you do for poverty reduction, we can argue about that. One thing I do know for sure is that usually pro-poor policies are poor policies. Okay? So you have to think about something which is not pro-poor in the simple sense. You have to think about something, usually, as I said, they're poor for two reasons. One, they're poorly funded because the middle class does not support them. And two, usually, because they're for poor, they don't have a social anchoring. They can be reversed easily. Now, we are faced in Africa with a big dilemma. And this brings the China problem that when the founders of the OAU, one thing they had as a condition, the OAU was supposed to be funded entirely by African states. And that was maintained for quite a long time. Okay. And now we have an African Union funded by outsiders. And this is a big problem because regional integration is an attempt to redefine yourself in the geopolitics of the world. Okay? You're trying to define your position in this larger world. You then don't allow the others who have similar projects of defining their position to define you. I mean, because they will define you in terms of how they are trying to define themselves in the position. So Europe is trying to define Africa in terms of Europe's own thinking about the world, okay, and how Europe fits into this world. Now, and that's a legitimate interest for Europe. Europe have legitimately pursuing the interests of Europe. For us to believe that China or India or Europe will actively involved in a project that redefines Africa's position in the world, I think is a little bit naive. Because regional integration is a diplomatic move by nation states. Either they're too weak and they want to get together and get stronger so they can deal with a larger part of the world. And that, and I think in Africa we don't often think about how these things for other people are important parts of their diplomacy. Okay? So you find a very bizarre situation where Europe is training Africans on how to negotiate with Europe. Now, of course, they're going to train you on how to lose. I mean, so you don't see Chinese being trained by Europe on how to negotiate with Europe. I mean, this is, there's things that, and again, it's not an evil intention of Europe. The European and the Eurocrats are amazingly consistent on European interests in any negotiations. I mean, it can be on something very trivial for Europe as a whole, okay? But once it's on the European agenda, they'll pursue it consistently. I mean, you would say, why are you worrying about tobacco? Tobacco for Europe is nothing, you know? But if one member state pushes it on the agenda, they will pursue it, to the end. So I think we just have to be, to reflect on this, the expectation that outsiders will happily join us in weakening them, which the story is about regional integration. We're trying to strengthen ourselves, and in the process, you're undermining other people's presence in Africa, and that I don't see why they should push with that. And so I'm a little bit worried about this funding of, the low levels of development, of course, as I said, it's a chicken and egg problem. You want integration to help you to industrialize, but it's very difficult to integrate if you're not industrialized. So that's where you thinking strategically to break the cycle requires. You're required to think quite strategically about how to break the cycle. The example was given in fact that countries like Angola and they're trading with outside, exporting their stuff, and so they have no interest in regional integration. Yes, because in a sense, our own debate. Again, if you look at read the Lagos Plan of Action carefully, but Lagos Plan of Action has all kinds of things in it. It's a long list. It's not coherent sometimes, but the assumption, our debate in Africa about resources is who outside Africa will consume our resources. We never see ourselves as big consumers. We actually think that if we're producing coal from TET, it will go to China. And so if the regional project does not suggest to Mozambique that there is a market for coal in the region, and there's no long-term project that suggests that there will be demand for those products here, of course they'll all move outside. So we have to, again, to begin to have a debate on regional integration in which these resources are, the use of those resources within the continent are important, and convince the producers of those resources that African market matters. I mean, there's been this big debate about the famous Inga project, which apparently if it's carried out will bring huge amounts of electricity. But some company decided that they would capture half of the output for a refinery of bauxite and aluminum refinery in Congo, and almost threatened South Africa's interest in the project, because this company was going to use 400,000, huge amounts of the output for processing the bauxite and this would make, of course, the Congo more interested in that company than in South Africa if South Africa does not provide the same outlet for their consumption. And that's where bureaucracies can be important in indicating how these economies are actually related, or can be more intensely related. And so if states are a hindrance, it's partly because in a sense we don't provide an answer to a particular project, and we don't think strategically about each other, about our neighbor. We don't see our neighbor as strategically important to our own project. Okay? We see them as a nuisance, and we don't see, I'm from Malawi, and Mozambique is our most important neighbor, and I think we must have the lowest level ambassador in Maputo. The most important country in Malawi today is Mozambique. Okay? They can bring us to a stop if they wanted to. Okay? But our mind says, no, London is more important. So we don't see each other strategically. It's ironic that they're building a railroad. Brazil is building a railroad through Malawi to Nacala, okay? Carrying coal. It takes a Chinese company to say, well, why don't you build a thermal plant in Malawi to use coal from TET to supply energy from Malawi? Because between Malawi and Mozambique, neither of them thought of each other as a market. Okay? And those are sort of small things that we have to begin to think about how Now, Afrocrats, how do you produce good Afrocrats? Look, most countries, in the developed countries, the production of their bureaucracies is a matter of central interest. In some cases, they are sent to one school, or some schools, similar schools, similar educational center. And in Africa, at the national level, we've all been trained in all kinds of universities. So you go to an African bureaucracy, there are BAs from America, from Russia, from China, from national ones, and they have no respect for each other's degrees, and they're running the same civil service, okay? And that is not very smart. It's not very smart, because just as we have failed to create coherent national bureaucracies, we're having the same problem at the institution. I would suggest, for instance, that the African Union identify 1 or 2 universities where all their bureaucrats will spend 3 or 4 months, okay, before they join the African Union, okay, just to begin to create a coherent story for them, similar training, similar premises for doing that. You have to create a bureaucracy. Bureaucracies are not, they don't make themselves individually. They're created by whoever wants them, and that's what the Afrocrat problem is. That people are not sure about each other's competencies because they're coming from different degrees. They haven't gone through a similar training process, and so they come with these problems of incoherence at the global level. Is it more feasible to have African integration today when there are no statesmen? The statesmen of yesterday were, yes, they were more committed, but I would, with all the headaches they created for us, they had one thing which stuck, what they were focused on, and which in many ways placed the idea of economic integration secondary. It was the liberation of Africa. The amount of time that was spent by the OAU on the liberation struggle was enormous. And it was only with South Africa's liberation that then issues of economic come back on the agenda full scale. So I think that to be more optimistic, that with the preoccupation that liberation, liberation now is over, we can begin to talk about economic problems more seriously. So that the first founding fathers, the Kaundas and all that, it was the liberation struggle, and they could put their country through enormous pain economically to get the story of liberation through. And that was, I think, what was important about there being statesmen. The new generation will have to have the second liberation, if you like, the liberation of the African economies. Okay? The other ones did their task. I wrote, when Mandela died, I wrote a piece on Mandela, and where I said, for my generation, Mandela's death was to mark the end of a struggle, one struggle. Okay? Now it's next struggle, the economic struggle, the struggles for democracy and all that. And that would require a new type of leadership. I don't think the first statesmen would do well in this new task. They were good for one thing. Some of them have overstayed, but they were good for one thing, and that thing has been accomplished. Africa is free. We can think about the next problem.